Hi everyone, Leah from Lekela Music here, and today's video is all about memorization. Do you need to do it? Are there advantages, disadvantages, and what's the best way to go about it? So this is a skill that I'm really interested in getting better at too, so let's get started. So the first question is, do you actually need to memorize music, and how much, and should you memorize everything, a few pieces, part of a piece? Let's look at some reasons why memorization might be a good thing to do to start off with. So the number one reason for me is expression. So if you can play a piece from memory, it suggests, mind, that's not a given, and we'll come back to that later, but it suggests that you're familiar enough with the nuts and bolts of the music that you're playing so that you can turn your attention to aspects of the performance and communication as you're playing. So your mental resources aren't devoted to reading the notes and rhythm, so you can experiment with the dynamics and the tempo and the expressiveness and really bring the music to life. Another great reason is just freedom. So freedom to just sit down and play a favourite piece wherever, whenever, for whoever. You have a mental library of repertoire that you carry around with you. And a third reason might be confidence. This one comes with a caveat because you'll only feel confident if you've gone about memorizing the music the right way. So if you're playing a piece from memory just as a way of avoiding having to look at the notes on the page, or you're relying on muscle memory alone to get you through, then the likelihood is you won't feel that confident. If you've gone about it the right way though, you can be confident in your confidence and actually just really enjoy playing. You might even get into that elusive state where the music feels like it's flowing through you rather than being played by you. Another good reason would be that you're freeing up mental resources to focus on other things. So even if you don't end up memorizing entire pieces, if there are sections that you know by heart, that's going to help you feel more confident about the rest. Or if you know one hand by heart, for example, maybe you know the sequence of chords in the left hand, that's going to free up brain space to focus on reading the right hand. So we should probably also think about why memorization might not be such a good thing, and we've touched on it already when we talked about confidence and the suggestion that memorized music is automatically secure. Again, if your memorization is haphazard and it comes about just as a result of lots of repetition and as a way of avoiding having to really study the music, then trust me, that's not a good thing, because that kind of memorization it's not reliable. It'll let you down at the worst possible time, usually mid-performance, because it's very susceptible to nerves. And because that kind of memorization also tends to be very inflexible, it's likely to leave you stranded, like in the middle of a piece with no idea of how to continue and no choice but to go back to the start and try again. And I think we've all had that experience and we'd all rather not repeat it. Anyway, let's go through a few general principles for good memorization. And then we're going to look at three pieces at different levels and see if we can apply the principles to them. By the way, it's not really a question of whether you're a person who's better at memorization or a person who's better at reading. If you're better at one or other, it's because you apply more energy to developing one or other skill. Because memorization, it is a skill just like reading, and it can be practiced and improved just like any other skill. You might decide that ultimately you have a preference for one thing or the other, but I don't want you to think that it's anything to do with aptitude. Yeah, it's a learnable skill. So where do you begin if you decide to memorize a piece of music? Now, you don't have to memorize every piece you're working on, so maybe just choose one or two to begin with, but start memorizing as early in the process as you can when you're learning a piece. And I'd suggest that you start with a new piece rather than a piece that you're already playing, purely because in essence you've already memorized a certain choreography with a piece that and sometimes you're looking at the page and sometimes you're looking at your hands, and it's going to be quite hard to relearn that in a different way. So pick a new piece and decide from the beginning that your goal is to be able to play it from memory. You should only attempt to memorize music that's not challenging to you in any other respect. If you're working on a piece that you're finding really difficult in other ways, I think you're probably asking too much of yourself to also try and play it from memory. Later on, you'll probably be able to do it, but while you're still developing your skills, I would focus on music a few levels below where you're working. If you're an absolute beginner and there aren't any levels below what you're working on, you can try looking for rote piano lessons on YouTube and follow those. There's a lovely one called Funny Puppy that I can think of straight away. I'll put the channel name on the screen so you can find it. Otherwise, yeah, go for it, but just watch the rest of this video first and don't beat yourself up if there are pieces that you can memorize and ones that just refuse to cooperate. So the next step then would be to get very familiar with the music itself and how it's represented on the page. So that might mean listening many times to a recording or to a YouTube video while following the score and testing yourself to see if you can hum the melody from memory, for example, or can you sing the left hand? Are there certain landmarks in the music? What are the highest and lowest notes in the melody? Or are there contrasting passages? You're always looking for the bit where it's actually just a descending scale of G, or the bit where it's a repeating sequence, or the bit where the rhythm is in triplets, or because those are your landmarks, and that's how we find a way through a city or a country, isn't it? By looking for familiar landmarks. And actually, that's one of the things that distinguishes ineffective from effective memorization. So imagine you have to drive or walk from your house to your friend's house on the other side of town, okay? And let's say they only recently moved there, so the journey isn't quite automatic yet, and your mental map, let's say, goes like this. You turn out your drive, you go left, you pass the neighbour's house, and past the pink house, and past the yellow house, and past the other yellow house, and then the grey house, and then you go past the blue house, and then you turn right, and you go past the school, and then you go past the white house, and then past the bus stop, and then past the other blue house, and past the yellow house, and past the... Did I pass the blue house yet? Do I pass the white house or the grey house next? I can't remember. I always get stuck right here. Anyway, okay, I'll go back to the start and I'll try again, and hopefully I'll get a bit further next time. Yeah? I really hope that's not how you navigate. So more likely, you think of turning left out of your drive, right at the school, continuing until I pass the supermarket, and then turn left and your friend's house is across from the park. In other words, you're far less likely to get lost with a few big landmarks instead of a lot of small landmarks. And in your music, if you're relying on muscle memory and trying to remember all the notes in the order that they come in, you're destined to fail, or at least not be able to reliably perform the piece, because any degree of nervousness is fatal to music memorized like that. If you're playing anything from memory, most likely you're already doing this to a certain extent. You have certain landmarks that you know, so you know exactly what certain passages look like, but maybe just not all of them, and there are certain places that you might not be sure of at all, and certainly that you wouldn't be able to describe. So by studying the score while you're listening to the music, you should eventually be able to describe the journey as if you were giving directions. But you won't be able to do that until you can analyse the music, so that's going to be our next step. So you need to understand the structure of the music, both in the macro and the micro. So the macro, the big picture, might just be noticing the form of the music. So maybe it's A, B, A. So that would be one section, a contrasting section, and then the first section again, which comes back maybe slightly differently the second time around. Or maybe it's a rondo, like Furelise, like, a theme that keeps returning. You can include things like key signature and time signature here too for the big picture. And I think most of us are fairly quick to pick up on the macro side of things, but it's the micro-analysis that's really going to help you find your way through the music from memory. So this is going to be noticing what predictable things are happening. So for example, let's say your music's in the key of F major, so your tonic is F and your dominant is C, and your opening bars and the ending are most probably going to be centered around those chords, or the chords or the notes that belong to those chords. And so in a lot of my videos I refer to the concepts of tonic and dominant, so if you're not sure what I'm talking about, or maybe if you need a refresher, you might pause this video and go and watch. I'll put a link to it here, and then come back, and this will make a lot more sense then. So then you can look for things like modulations, which is where the music moves from one key to another, and you'll start to see this happening quite often in music from about grade 1 or grade 2 onwards. So it's a concept that's really well worth getting familiar with. I must make a video about that. So you want to notice where modulations happen and how they come about in your particular piece. So what else? You're going to look for things like scales and chords in the music. Anywhere that you have a run of notes, it's very likely to be a scale segment of some description. Maybe it's a recognisable scale of D that just doesn't happen to start or end on that note. It might start on an F sharp and run down an octave and a half to end on an A, but you can still think of it in terms of a scale of D. You can look for sequences, so those are repeating patterns of notes played in different places, and you can look for things like arpeggios, or you can look for any pattern that makes sense to you, even if you can't describe it in words, because maybe you've just noticed something that happens in the music that stands out for you, and you can easily remember it. So all of these little bits and pieces have something in common. What you're doing when you look for them and make a note of them is what's called information chunking. So here's an example. I'm going to put a string of numbers on the screen, and I want you to try and memorize as many as you can in 5 seconds, okay? Don't get anxious. Here we go. Go. Stop. How did you do? Well, the typical working memory, which is the part of your short-term memory that holds on to information for just enough time for your brain to decide if it needs to send it to long-term memory or just forget about it. Your working memory can typically hold on to about 6 or 7 separate pieces of information at one time. And I only gave you 5 seconds, so you probably didn't even get a chance to take in that many numbers. And that was a string of 24 numbers. So unless they have some kind of significance for you, it's impossible to remember them. But I can remember them easily. You ready? So 31031685 1612177001031810. So how impressive was that? Very impressive. But you know, of course, that it's not impressive at all because there was a trick, of course. There's always a trick. Because for me, that wasn't 24 pieces of information, was it? That was actually only 3. Those were the dates of birth of Bach, Beethoven and Chopin. So I can retain more information by taking smaller units of information and chunking them into larger, more significant groups that are easier to remember. So if we apply that to our music, even a short piece can have a couple of hundred notes. So if you're trying to memorize a piece by learning this note and then that note and then the next note, well, you could be a long time persuading your short-term memory to transfer that to long-term as a viable entry. But if you can find the kinds of patterns that we talked about earlier, then suddenly your 250 note piece just becomes a 6 idea piece, and therefore it's just much more manageable. As you gain more experience in reading music and hopefully spend more time trying to understand the theory behind each piece you tackle, you'll build up a sort of vocabulary, if you like, of things to look out for. Having said that, your ear is a very important part of this, because not every bar or passage of music is going to have a nice clear chord or scale in it, but it will have a musical idea. So if you familiarize yourself thoroughly with it, as I said earlier, following the score as you listen, you'll be much better placed to keep going from memory. And just to back this up, there was some research done back in 1984 where they compared the ability of composition students to piano performance students to memorize music, and the composition students actually did way better because they have a better understanding of the structure of music, so they were instinctively chunking. Okay, so once you've gotten as familiar as you can with the structure and the geography, for want of a better word, I'm sure there's a better word, of the music, it can be really helpful to divide the piece into sections and to number them so that you'll have, section 1, section 2, etc. How you do that will differ from piece to piece. Maybe it already has sections that repeat, like in many short classical pieces, and that might do. Or you might want to subdivide those further in a way that makes sense to you. As you're listening, you'll hear certain points in the piece that make sense as, places to start a new section. There's no rule here, it's up to you, but the idea is that as you go about memorizing the music, instead of thinking of it as one long piece, you're breaking it up into 4 or 5 or 6 shorter pieces that just follow each other consecutively. The crucial thing is that you're going to practice each section as if it were its own piece, so that your memorization doesn't just start at the beginning of the music, but maybe at the beginning of each section. Of course, you'll also have to build in, practicing flowing from one section into the next, so it doesn't sound like separate pieces, but I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. So essentially it's like having a built-in safety net, because in many ways if you get used to being able to jump in at the beginning of any section, then you're never going to be entirely stuck if you have a failure of memory. So the worst case scenario, you get stuck in the middle of one section, you just jump to the next and keep going. And of course that in itself has to be practiced, for example, by playing through, Daisy sneezing there, playing through one section and then deliberately jumping to the next. A nice side effect of that is actually as you become more confident in your ability to jump around in the piece, you're less likely to actually have a memory slip, because you're less likely to become nervous because you have that confidence of knowing that you know your piece really well. So at this stage, hopefully you'll have listened a lot to the music while you follow the score, and you'll have done at least a little analysis of the patterns in the music that are going to help you chunk the information. But there are going to be parts of the music, and maybe even large parts of the music, that don't follow any obvious patterns that you can latch onto. So inevitably there's going to be some hard work involved in just learning it off. Your sections are going to help, and when you're practicing, it's really important that you don't just start at the beginning and try to add notes on as you memorize. So if you're planning on spending, say, 30 minutes today working on memorizing a piece, that your best course of action is not to spend the whole 30 minutes on one section, but to, you know, take 3 sections and spend 10 minutes on each of those different sections. So, I mean, what can happen is if you're not careful is that you end up with a piece that starts off really strong and gets progressively weaker and weaker as you go along, because all the practice has been done on the beginning. So if you mix up those sections and devote, you know, set chunks of time to each of those sections, then you're going to have a much more evenly paced piece, and you won't end up with, you know, the last section being much weaker than the rest. So with all that in place, then the hard work really begins, and the key here is repetition. So what's happening in the brain as you memorize the piece is that you're developing a network of neural connections that are devoted to just that piece of music and all the information that goes with it. That's from deciphering the notation on the page to the physical movements you make in order to execute it, to the sounds we expect to hear, and maybe the feelings and the narratives that the music might inspire in us. These all combine into a network of signaling nerve cells. If we take a series of notes and play them once, a group of cells in the brain fires off signals among themselves, and those signals leave a tiny, tiny trace. If you never play that series of notes again, that signal path it will fade quite quickly, and the cells go off and do other stuff, you know, they'll learn a new recipe or something. But if you repeatedly play that series of notes, every time those signals between the cells fire off, the pathway gets stronger and stronger, and eventually it becomes, you know, quite permanent. That's why if you ever learn to play a piece as a child and then you came back to it as an adult, you might be surprised to find that you actually remember it quite well, at least in part because you played it so often as a child. Interestingly, the parts that will have suffered most memory decay would be the harder bits, or the bits towards the end, because you probably didn't practice those as much. Anyway, back to our neural pathways. So as you're doing your careful repeats, and remember you're playing at the speed of no mistakes, you get an extra bonus. So with every repeat that you carry out, the brain secretes a tiny, tiny amount of a substance called myelin, and that basically wraps itself around the neural pathways, and it acts as a kind of an insulation. So the more myelin that you have around a pathway, the faster the information can go through and the more permanent it is. So over time and with enough repetition, the memory becomes permanent and reliable, and you don't have to think so hard about the notes. It just becomes quite automatic. The other thing that you probably already know is that a little and often beats a lot done less regularly. So when you work on learning something, your brain has to process that new information, and it usually does that while you sleep later on that night. So when you come back to practice the next day, your practice is going to be building on that foundation. So even if the improvement is really, really imperceptible, it's just tiny from day to day, if you just do a heap of practice once a week, you're actually only going to get to process that once, and then there's loads of time for that neural pathway to start fading away again before you get to practice again, you know, in another week's time. So that's kind of a waste of time. So think of the cycle as work, sleep, and sleep is the magic ingredient. I heard somewhere actually that really high level students of music will often do a couple of hours of practice, a really focused practice, and then they'll need to nap for an hour or two, and then they'll come back and do more work. So that napping is actually just really important for them to process the information. I don't think they're doing it strategically. I think it's obviously they're just tired out after doing a very intense couple of hours. But that's the effect. It allows the brain to actually process the information so that they can continue and then build on it. And most of us aren't working at that level, obviously, but we still need to process what we've been practicing, and that happens while you're asleep, so that's really important. So as you progress with your piece, you might want to test yourself to see how secure you are in your playing. And one way to do that is through mental visualization. So for example, you might just close your eyes and imagine yourself playing your piece and see, can you actually see the notes? Can you, like we said before, when you're actually giving directions, can you tell yourself, okay, I'm running up from C to C, and then I'm coming back down as far as G, and then I'm heading up again. Do I know which chords I'm playing in the left hand? You know, going through each musical idea. And quite often you'll find pretty quickly that you can't remember what comes next, or how the next phrase begins, and what comes after this particular note, or you have a broken chord here, but then what happens next, and you know that there's a run of notes and there's an interval of a fourth somewhere in the middle of it, but where does that actually happen? So that's a real opportunity to make your playing really, really secure, make your memorization really, really secure. Because if you can really see it in your mind, exactly where everything is, then you can play it on the keyboard, and even as nervous as you get, you'll still be able to find that information. If you're a person with aphantasia and you don't have a visual imagination, you can do the same thing by seeing if you can write down the music from memory. That's a very common exercise actually of music students to actually see. Can you write down the piece? And actually in the starting stages of learning a piece, you can write it out as well. So you can go from memory, or you can write it down, and if you want to do both, that is even more excellent. So finally, you need to practice performing. So presumably the reason you want to memorize your music in the first place is because you want to be able to perform it, if the opportunity arises. But of course, playing a piece in your living room with only the cat listening is a very different proposition to playing for one or more human beings who might actually judge you. That's terrifying. So you're naturally going to get nervous. And there's no cure for nerves, by the way. The more you try to resist nerves, the worse they get. So you're better off just accepting them and working with them. We can get used to performing in spite of feeling nervous. And if you've prepared your music carefully and know it thoroughly, you'll still be able to play it through. Just like, if you're driving to your friend's house and something else is on your mind, you'll still know how to get there even though you're distracted. And if you've practiced jumping between the sections, you can always do that if you have a memory glitch. Your audience won't actually mind too much. So you can also practice performing by recording yourself, or for playing for somebody you trust, or just by imagining that you're performing. So anything that makes you actually feel nervous is just a good rehearsal for the real thing. And playing when you're nervous will really highlight as well where you're not quite as secure as you thought you were. Okay, so let's have a quick look at a few pieces and what we might look for in them to help us memorize them as patterns rather than just a stream of notes. So we're going to look briefly at a late elementary level piece, Museet, you might be familiar with it, an intermediate piece, which is the Mozart K545 Sonata in C major, which everybody has at least heard, and a more advanced piece, so it's going to be the first movement of Telemann's Fantasia in G minor, and that's currently on the ABRSM grade 7 exam syllabus. So here we have Museet in D, a very popular piece, and as you can see we're in the key of D. So our tonic then is going to be D, and our dominant is going to be A. So those are going to be two important notes. If you look at the left hand in the first two bars, there's immediately a very easy pattern. We're in the key of D, and we've just got D octaves, D to D, up and down. In the right hand in the first two bars, we have 5 notes. And if you're learning this, you'll have listened to it, you'll be familiar with the rhythm, but you can count it 1 E and a 2 E and for 2 beats in the bar, and it repeats. Okay, so there's a little landmark straight away that you can watch out for. But look at the notes themselves. So if you think of the first 5 notes of the scale of D, we've got D, E, F sharp, G, and A. Okay, and that's what we're seeing here, just backwards. So it's A stepping down to D, A stepping down to D. So in the second 2 bars, then we see that we just come down an octave, and we're still in that D position. So now we have our third finger going on to F sharp. So we're starting on F sharp, we're stepping up to A, and then we're stepping down, down, down as far as E, not quite. So think of it this way, A not quite down as far as D. We stop on the E, and then our last 3 notes in this first phrase are just a chord of D major. So the notes in the chord of D major will be D, F sharp, and A. So we're just descending in descending order. Okay, even if you started playing this and didn't pay any attention to what was going on in it, you'd very quickly notice that our left hand is playing exactly the same thing in these 2 bars. Okay, so there's a lovely pattern right there on its own. You don't need to learn both hands. Your left hand is just going to play exactly what the right hand is playing. Then coming to the second line, you can see then this first 2 bars are just repeating Here, this is repeating, and the last bar is almost identical, except that instead of the last two notes being F sharp to D, we just go from A straight down to D. So we're just going dominant back to tonic, just to the home note. So we're able to describe very clearly what's happening throughout this first section of Museet. And in fact, if you, there's two sections to Museet, the form it takes is kind of, it's ABA roughly, but actually, as you can see, this bit repeats. Then we go into the next section, and the next section repeats as well. So it's kind of an AABABA format. But as you can see, that this A is the first section, so we're going to get great mileage out of that because it comes back repeated twice here and it's repeated twice there. So it takes up 2/3 of the piece. So it's an easy one to memorize. The second part has lots of landmarks in it too, and little patterns that can be memorized. It's slightly more complex, but this is a nice introduction, and this is a lovely little section played on its own. So in this example, we're going to look at the famous Sonata in C major by Mozart, that everybody's familiar with. And we're going to look at this one. This is more of an intermediate level. So we're going to look at this one in terms of the more common chords that we're going to find in it. So the more common chords will be the one chord, 4, and 5. Okay, so that'll be our tonic, dominant, and subdominant. C being the tonic, G being the dominant, and F being our subdominant. So looking at the left hand particularly, because it'll be very handy just to memorize the left hand chords roughly. So you can see in the first bar we've got what we call an Alberti bass, so that's just a broken chord of C. We're going C to G to E and up and down like that. That's just repeating, and that pattern repeats throughout that first line. I'll just write that in case you haven't come across that before. It's called an Alberti bass, after a composer called Alberti, who used this quite a lot and made it popular. So so this is our one chord. This is just a chord of C major, isn't it? And then we come here to the first half of the second bar, and we've got our 5 chord. It's a 5/7, so it's a G chord, but with our 7th note, which would be the F there. So that's a 5/7. Very common to find a 5/7 in music, not just a dominant chord, but a dominant 7. And then we're back to our tonic chord there. And then here you can see very clearly we've got our subdominant, our F major chord, back to 1. These are the chords we'd expect to find, and here's our dominant, and back to 1. So it's just going back and forth between tonic, dominant, and subdominant throughout that. So that's kind of easy to remember. Our first 3 notes, look at our first 3 notes just forming a nice chord of C major right there in the top. In our second line, so these are nice examples of scales, basically. So we're in the key of C, so it's as if we're playing scales of C all the time, but we're just not starting on C because we have the same. We're not using any black notes, so it's the same as if we were playing a C scale, just starting in different places. So here we're starting on A, running up as far as A, an octave higher, coming back down to A, but then we go one further. We go down to the next note, and that's an important little landmark there to bring your 4th finger over there to allow you to reach that. Go down one further here is going to be an important part of your memorization. So then we've got G, going up to G, coming back down to G, and again with your 4th finger over, bringing you one further. Now we're going F to F, back down, same thing again, E to E, and then down to D, and then we have a slightly changed run of notes here. But you can see that's a fairly clear example of the kinds of patterns that you might find in a piece of classical music. Again, as we go through this piece, there's lots of landmarks and things that you can use, broken chords and arpeggios that you can use to kind of memorize it as you go along. But that's just to demonstrate how it starts off. And so finally, we're going to look at this Telemann piece, Vivace, from the Fantasia in G minor. Apologies, it's not as clear in parts as it could be. Let's just bring up our pen. Okay, so this is more of an advanced piece. This is about a grade 7, so it's sort of early advanced level. So what we want to keep in mind, just looking at the first section of it, is that we're in the key of G minor here. So if we look at the notes that are in the chord of G minor, we've got a G, B flat, and D. Okay, and that's very useful to remember here at the beginning. So the first thing we notice, okay, so on the left hand we're starting off with an octave G chord. That's really announcing that we're in some kind of G, key of G, G major, G minor. And then we have this sequence that happens in the first in the opening bars 3 times. So a sequence is a repeating pattern of notes that just happens in different places. So 1, 2, 3, and then it goes off in slightly different direction there. So once you kind of have you'll use the same fingering. If you've got a sequence, it's a good idea to use the same fingering each time you play it. So here, the starting note is of interest to us. So the first note is D. The second sequence starts on B flat, and the third sequence starts on G. So as you see, those are the 3 notes of our chord of G minor. So it's really just really announcing we're in G minor. Here's our chord, and here's a little riff based around the opening notes of the 3 component notes of that chord. In the left hand, you also have a sequence of descending thirds. So once you've kind of got an idea of where they begin, again, you're going to have the same fingering and just coming down. So that's quite easy to remember in that section. It's slightly more complex in the next line, but you still have lots of broken chords and repeating patterns. So this bar here, let's call this A, is the same as this bar here. So they're both A. That's just for the sake of identifying them. There's a broken chord. There's a snippet of a chord. There's our dominant going to tonic, dominant going to tonic, and then a little bit to remember there perhaps. There's our G, D, G, so tonic, dominant, tonic. I can see something similar happening down here on E flat, B flat to, again, it's octaves with a fifth in between. But here is something quite interesting here in the second 2 lines of the first page. So we have this, it's kind of, it's a sequence as well, with sort of little bits in between that break it up slightly. So it has a repeating note. Each sequence has a repeating note. Here it's G. Second time it's stepped down to F. Then here it is on E flat. That top note there, E flat, E flat, E flat. Then D. And then here's C. Okay, so it's a sequence with the repeating note coming down a step each time, and then the notes in between have a pattern as well. So we have E flat here, we step up 1 to G, and then we're kind of just stepping all the way down to A. Over here it begins, we start on D, we step up to E flat, and then we step all the way down to G. Here we start on the C, up to D, step all the way down to F, and then it sort of slightly changes, it omits this step up. Here it's going to start on C and step all the way down to E flat. Here it's starting on B flat, stepping all the way down to D. So you can see lots of little patterns and things thrown in here and there that kind of give a piece structure. It gives it predictability, because our ear needs to hear predictability in music so that we can understand it, but also enough variety so that it keeps us interested. And that's what's been done beautifully here in the Telemann. Okay, so I think that lot should get you started. Like any other skill, you'll get better at memorizing the more you do, and it's got to be so good for your brain, right? By the way, I came across a great little book on memorizing music, written by a harpsichordist, but still relevant to us. So you'll find a link to that in the description if you're interested in learning more about that. I'd love to hear if any of you have any other tips to share, so please do share them in the comments if you do, and I'd love to hear how you get on in general, memorising a piece. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and subscribe, and hit the bell thingy if you'd like to be notified whenever I put up a new video. I've got a list as long as my arm at this stage of topics to make videos about, so I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into those. So there's plenty more to come. In the meantime, I'll see you soon, and happy practicing.